Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to PLATO Frontiers in Life Sciences. Oh. Around here. I forgot about the camera. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work at the Biotechnology Center. This is Paul Brandel. He helps, he's the co-organizer of this outfit as well as me. And it's a pleasure to introduce today. You go by Jim or James?
Jim for you guys.
Jim Conway. Appreciate
My
that.
friends call me Jim. You guys are in the circle of trust.
Next week, Dan Young is going to be here from entomology, and he's going to talk about the insect Armageddon. And in 2 weeks, Kathy Krentz will be here from the Biotech Center talking about CRISPR with transgenic animals in biomedical sciences. And so, did everybody get the full lineup in the email? You didn't let me know. Okay, great. And then tonight, at Wednesday night at the lab, Hillary Dugan will be talking about the impact of salt on Wisconsin's fresh waters. You can watch that by Zoom as well as being in person. Next week is International Brain Awareness Week. We've been quoting lines from The Wizard of Oz, so let's go with "If I Only Had a Brain." It's a wonderful thing to have a brain. Jerry Yin is going to talk about what can fruit flies teach us about the persistence of memory. Jerry's in the genetics department and the neurology department in the School of Medicine and Public Health. Then on March 23rd, Jill Tyne-Niesenbaum from Physical Therapy in the School of Medicine and Public Health is going to talk with us about physical therapy management of osteoarthritis in the hip and knee. And then on March 30th, Robert Kirkdorfer from Biochemistry is going to talk about unpacking the SARS-CoV-2 virus, designing vaccines against the COVID-19 disease. So we got a lot of cool life sciences coming up here and also at Wednesday night lab. If you would stand there, that'd be great. We asked our.
So you can throw things at me. Is this where the
Yes,
the target spot?
we're going to throw you 5 difficult questions.
Excellent.
Where were you born?
I was born in beautiful Buffalo, New York,
Nice.
also known as God's country.
Yeah. Wow.
Buffalo, New York, a great place to be from.
And where'd you go to high school?
Amherst High School on the north side of Buffalo.
And where'd you go to for your undergrad and what did you study?
I was at Cornell University, the UW of the East. Also red and white. I was in the Agriculture and Life Sciences, Biological Sciences program.
And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
I went to medical school at Cornell in New York City on the Upper East Side. Then I did my pediatric residency at Northwestern Children's Memorial Hospital. Did an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Colorado. I was on the faculty at Indiana University for a little while, and then I was paroled and recruited to UW, and will never look back.
Very good. And you biked here today?
Every day.
Today, you're going to talk with us about where are we now? COVID pandemic vaccination update. Could we all join me in welcoming Jim Conway to PLATO Frontiers in Life Sciences?
The one small disclaimer is that the Badger Talks people thought I had already talked to you people. And so when they invited me to I said, I already gave that talk to these people. And they said, oh, you're right. So give the follow-up talk. So you're going to get the part 2, but it's actually good because it sounds like somebody else is going to do what my original talk used to be, which was how we actually developed the vaccines against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Uh-oh. Get rid of that. So as Tom mentioned, that's not good. Why is that? I can't disconnect it because it'll. Nope, that's not good either.
Get what's behind it.
Thank you. There's my tech wizard. Put it on his tab.
Yes.
So I'm a pediatric infectious disease specialist who has been focused on vaccine development as part of my career, but have really shifted over the last 20, 25 years into more vaccine policy, vaccine access, and vaccine delivery. I lead a lot of the global health programs on campus. I have projects in 12 different countries currently working with the CDC and trying to improve vaccine access for children around the globe. And so I've been studying and working on vaccine hesitancy well before all of this pushback about vaccines that we've all been dealing with around COVID. And that's part of the reason that you may have had the unfortunate occurrence of seeing me on the news and NPR and various other groups as we've tried to really bring together organizations to try to work together and try to figure out how we both message the importance of vaccines, but also get people to understand how the process works as far as safety and efficacy studying. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give you a sense for kind of where we've come to in the current state of the pandemic. And obviously, this has been a pretty rapidly evolving process, as all of you, I think, have whiplash from trying to keep up with the news. And I think one of the things that we've all dealt with and sort of seen is science being done in a fishbowl. I think that one of the things we all have to remember about the scientific method is that a single paper that says whatever is just a single paper that says whatever. Until it's been replicated over and over again, does it actually become an established fact. And yet, unfortunately, the media and this preprint publication process that we've seen over the last couple of years has really confused people, because a paper will come out that seems to say one thing and just can't be replicated. And so that doesn't become an established fact. But unfortunately, once things are on the internet, they're there indefinitely. And so it's understandable that at some level that the public has been confused by a lot of this. So one of the things we follow very closely when we're looking at vaccine efficacy in the vaccine programs is how we're doing from an epidemiology standpoint. So this is what the COVID case rates and COVID hospitalization rates have done just over the last couple of weeks. So on the right, these are from the New York Times. Dark colors are bad, light colors are good. And you can see that just 5 weeks ago, we were really in the thick of it. And all of a sudden, there's again this sort of glimmer of sunlight beaming through that we have to be careful about getting ourselves too impressed that this is the end. We've all obviously been through this before. But you can see how rapidly this evolves. I'm going to give you a bunch of data first, and then we'll sort of talk about what it means. And I left plenty of time for questions and thoughts. So because we have facilities now, we have patients at our Children's Hospital from 5 different states on a regular basis. We were just named the #1 hospital in Wisconsin and number 22 in the whole country at UW Health. And we've really done a great job, I think, of really building our programs. And we now run the only hospital in Northern Illinois that offers pediatric care at Swedish American Hospital. So we follow the data very closely from both Illinois and Wisconsin. And essentially this is Wisconsin on the left and Illinois on the right. And you can see that the number of new reported cases, so this was the peak back in November of 2020, when everybody thought that was a catastrophe. And you can see how bad things got as we went through these holidays and this Delta and then Omicron surge. So this is the number of cases in a, number of cases in a day. I'll try it this way. These are cases in a day. These are hospitalizations. These are ICU hospitalizations. And then this is the number of deaths being reported on a daily basis. And so while everybody's been so excited that things are better out here in the real world, we have to remember that the deaths lag about 2 to 4 weeks after the peak. And so we still are having plenty of deaths both here in Wisconsin as well as in Illinois, although those are actually starting to drop off as well. Again, you can see that we've had a lot more ICU hospitalizations relatively here in Wisconsin compared to Illinois, at least from a data reporting standpoint. But clearly we've gone through multiple surges of this, and the million-dollar question is, does this keep happening? Since I do a lot of global health, I want to make sure you have a little bit of a global perspective. So this has actually been the global occurrence. And so you can see that on a global scale, we've had multiple peaks throughout. But again, Omicron Delta overlap has really been an impressive surge. We've had about 1 million deaths here in the United States. We've had about 6 million deaths around the world. So the United States, unfortunately, accounts for about 16% of the deaths around the world. And I'm going to give you some reasons why we think that is. The major upsurge of cases that has happened over the last couple of months has largely been here in the US and Canada is the red, and then in Europe is the light blue. In other areas of the world, we're either much more comfortable mandating vaccines and requiring them for their citizens, or much more comfortable going into really a much more aggressive lockdown. We've really seen much tamped down in the way of the epidemiologic curve, a lot less large outbreaks. Now, I teach in Thailand every May, although I haven't been there for a couple of years, and my colleagues at the universities there haven't even been allowed on campus for over 1.5 years. I mean, that's how tightly some of the countries have decided they've restricted it. As you've heard, China has a zero tolerance policy and had their record number of cases in a day of 450 the other day. I mean, you get one case in a city of 11 million people, and that city goes into lockdown. So this is, sort of the yin yang of how you look at these things and how you manage them. I don't know if there's a right or a wrong, but there's no question that we have borne the brunt of this in sort of our freer and more open societies globally. And sadly, when I look around this young group of people, unfortunately, the folks in the older age groups have really unfortunately been the ones that have borne the brunt of the more severe versions of this disease. And so when we look at hospitalizations, and these dark blue lines are people here in the United States over the age of 70, you can see that before we had wide-scale access to vaccine, they were bearing the brunt of this. But this continues to be the trend, despite the wide availability and wide uptake of vaccines in these communities. And so I'm going to talk quite a bit about that, just given the nature of who you folks are. But you can see that each of these surges, while people have sort of in their mind decided to make claims that these are milder in children, for certain things, here's the uptick in kids. And actually, we have more kids in the hospital currently than we've had at any point, because kids bear the brunt of this twice. They have the risk of an acute illness, and then they get this thing that's called MISC, or multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which happens 4 to 8 weeks after they had their COVID infection. And so while everybody on the adult side is like, yay, we've just got people in the ICU, but we don't have as many new admissions. I was on call last week and I had more COVID MISC patients than I've had at any point in the pandemic. So it's really all relative to kind of where you are and which age group you deal with. So again, while everybody was claiming Omicron was more mild, we actually had more hospitalizations during Omicron than we've had at any other point during this entire pandemic. So you got to be a little careful with how the media likes to interpret these things. Now, granted, we were in full lockdown with schools closed, and so kids didn't have as much of an opportunity. But even when we did start opening up society, when we had that downturn in July, as soon as we reopened, kids certainly do get this illness. But as you can see, the older the individuals are, the worse that they suffer through this. Now, I work on vaccines. I'm a vaccine advocate. I've actually had a whole bunch of these vaccine preventable diseases. I've had typhoid, I had chickenpox, I had mumps, as I know many of you did as well. And I've seen each and every vaccine preventable disease that we vaccinate against. So I'm one of those people that has had the displeasure of actually having seen every vaccine preventable disease. I'm a vaccine zealot, and I'm very comfortable saying that. Vaccines are probably one of the most important things we've ever done as a society. And so while it was certainly understandable when vaccines were in very, very short supply, and we were limiting them and only prioritizing certain groups, either high-risk groups or groups that were essential to the continued functioning of our society, as vaccines became more and more available, it's become clear that the unvaccinated individuals are those that are suffering by far the bulk of this disease. And so you're, currently even during Omicron, where the vaccines don't quite work as well as we like, your risk of disease in that outbreak if you're unvaccinated is about 3 times higher than if you're fully vaccinated. And unfortunately, deaths are really where the money is at. And so throughout the pandemic, somewhere between 10 and 30 times risk of death from this disease if you're unvaccinated as opposed to being vaccinated. So how are we doing with vaccines across the country? So the overall numbers, so about 65% of Americans have been vaccinated fully. In the age groups ages 5 and up, about 69% when we kind of take out the under 4-year-olds. In a population of the high-risk populations, we've been extraordinarily pleased to see that the uptake has been really quite strong, 89%. Now, with that said, the other side of the coin is that it's sad for me to see that 11% have still not availed themselves and been able to be protected against this terrible disease. When we break down a little bit more, I think we're sort of having to kind of parse this out. While we look at all ages, 65% are fully vaccinated, 77% have at least had 1 dose. In the 5 and older group, at least we've started to get to the point where almost 80% have been immunized. And so when we look at least the over 65s, at least 95% have had 1 dose. So we've certainly had success in sort of moving the needle and convincing people to do these things. When we look at the epidemiology of vaccines, there's a couple of magic numbers that are really important. So we really want to achieve 90% herd immunity to be able to eliminate diseases. And that basically, if you think about it, 1 in 10 people are vulnerable to disease. There's 20 people in this room. Somebody walks in this room with measles and sits down there. If there's only 1 in 10 people that are susceptible that haven't been vaccinated in this room, the odds that they sit down to all of those people or both of them is pretty slim. So even if they infect one person, it doesn't spread very far. The problem is once you get below 80% immunization coverage, which doesn't sound like it's that big a difference, suddenly you're looking at 1 in 5 people are vulnerable. Suddenly we've got 4 people who are potentially vulnerable. And the odds that they could sit down to one of those next to one of those people is very high. And the odds that one of those people is actually close to one of the other ones is also very high. And so when you hear about vaccine immunization programs, the goal with a new vaccine is to try to at least start out very quickly to get to 70 or 80% immunization coverage. That's where you at least start to make a dent and can start to decrease the number and the size of the outbreaks. But you really can't talk about eradicating a disease until you get over 90% of the population that's immune. Now, the other part that we always have to factor into this is the immunity that you get from wild type infection or natural infection. And so that's always this kind of wild card that's a moving target. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because I think there's been a little bit too much, especially in the media, but also in some political groups, in trying to equate natural immunity with vaccine immunity. Because in fact, there's lots and lots of diseases where natural immunity actually is not very protective. And this, unfortunately, is one of those diseases. So whooping cough is a great example. You can get whooping cough, you can get it again a year later and a year after that. The vaccine is far more protective than the disease itself. Homophilus influenza, or what we used to be called Hib disease. When I was a kid growing up, I actually lost 2 of my classmates in kindergarten from Hib before there was a vaccine. And so I remember vividly how sick they got and how quickly they died. You can get that disease and then still get the disease again. The vaccine is actually superior to the natural immunity. And that is very clearly true with this particular disease as well. I'll show you some evidence of that. So when we add all this up, what we've found is that, we've certainly moved gradually into kind of the right space for people being what the CDC mistakenly labeled as fully vaccinated, which unfortunately was a misnomer. And so when we really talk about vaccines, we talk about the fact that you're either unvaccinated, you're partially vaccinated, or you're up to date. And up to date means we keep updating how many doses of a vaccine you need. And so when they came out with this term that nobody had ever used in my world ever, and decided that your 2 doses of your mRNA vaccine constituted being fully vaccinated, we actually sent them, and I was on a committee, we basically scolded them and they didn't want to walk it back. We said, you've given people the wrong idea. We know at some point boosters are going to be necessary, and we know that we're going to have to tell people you're only considered up to date when you had your first booster or your second booster, or who knows, we're going to figure this out over time. And they unfortunately stuck with this term fully vaccinated, which has really confused people, because as boosters have rolled out, there was a poll that just came out from the Kaiser Family Foundation, 40% of Americans who are eligible for a booster have no idea that they're eligible for a booster. They consider themselves, because they were told they were fully vaccinated, they think boosters are for special populations. And this is one of our biggest problems as you see how this pandemic has unfolded. How are we doing in Wisconsin? So Wisconsin, as you can see here in Dane County, we usually win almost everything from a public health standpoint. We are blessed by having one of the best public health departments in the entire state, as well as our flagship university, led by a whole bunch of people that believe in public health. And even in a community where our state legislature wouldn't allow us to require vaccines, it was an amazing thing that the UW campus here, students and faculty, have some of the highest immunization rates of anybody in the Big Ten, even though we're one of the few schools that doesn't have a vaccine requirement. So it's beauty to see that people can follow the science, can trust the scientists. Unfortunately, that messaging has not reached large areas of the state where immunization rates are lagging behind. When we break it down and we look at sort of who are the people that are vaccinated, again, our older age groups have been fairly compliant with our recommendations, although well behind, in most cases, the national averages. So while we started out way ahead of the curve, in fact, and actually we're written up in the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post for Dane County being actually one of the first counties that had reached some of the highest thresholds, things really leveled off very quickly. And as you can see, that even though vaccines have been available for quite some time for these younger adults, they still lag behind where we think they need to be to really have enough herd immunity. When you break it down by ethnic groups, you can see obviously that we have disparities across the state that continue to persist, but unfortunately or fortunately, these seem to be relatively equally distributed across most of the ethnic groups, with the exception of the Black population. So we're a little behind. These are only 1 doses, by the way, so we're even further behind on getting people their 2 doses or fully vaccinated, let alone boosters. This is a little busy, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense for how this has really evolved globally, where we were sort of here. The United States is this kind of funny, I don't know, orange, brown color. And so, as we got into the early summer of 2021, we were really one of the, other than, this is Israel. So Israel, as everybody knows, was basically one of the trial sites for Pfizer to do everything. They paid top dollar. They were one of the first countries that got Pfizer vaccine. So they kind of came out of the gate first, but we really sort of caught up quickly. And unfortunately, what happened here in the United States is things really just leveled off. When we went through that, kind of nice late spring, early summer, we all thought things were going to be great. Everybody started going to baseball games again. Mm-hmm. People, unfortunately, took that a little bit too much to heart. And so our immunization rate really has dropped off, as opposed to other countries. This is Cuba, Chile, China, Canada. Most of the European Union actually jumped above us as far as the proportion of their populations that were immunized. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you look at sort of where we are compared to other countries, again, while we were one of the first countries to have access to vaccine, these are the countries that have now been sort of the ones that have really promoted and gotten the majority of their populations, and especially their high-risk populations, into booster status, as opposed to the United States, where we've really lagged behind. And
can you clarify, booster is the third shot?
Booster is the third shot for healthy individuals. It's the fourth shot for those that have an immune compromising condition.
And it's a second shot for those of us who got Pfizer one and done.
Oh, Johnson & Johnson.
Excuse me.
So Johnson & Johnson, I'll talk about that because I've got it, because again, this is one of the things I think that the poor people in the United States have suffered from, is that there's been so many different messages, and each vaccine is slightly different. Like, even those of us that this is what I do every day have to stop and pause and think through it before I figure it out. And that's, again, part of the problem with having defined fully vaccinated and giving people this false sense of security. So, as of a couple days ago, we were only at about 25%, 28% of our population has had this incredibly important booster, because one of the things we've really quite readily recognized is that while the primary vaccines helped against alpha, beta, and lambda, and even held up pretty well against Delta, you really needed a booster for full immunity against Omicron. And there's no question about that. So this is kind of what's happened as far as other countries jumping quite ahead of us on the booster side of things. And that then directly correlates with death throughout the pandemic. So this is the entire pandemic, where, as I mentioned, although we started out with vaccines well before everybody else, most of these other countries have actually gotten more and more of their population immunized. We've continued to lag behind. And so we now have proportionally so the highest cumulative deaths throughout the pandemic. And again, even though people kept saying that Omicron was milder, it certainly wasn't if you were one of the ones that ended up in the intensive care unit. And again, this directly correlates with our poor booster rates. So
why is Japan so low?
Yeah, Japan is an interesting place. Japan has a very strong and very traditional vaccine hesitancy across the entire country, including at the government level. They only, from a routine standpoint, we give basically 18 different diseases our kids are protected against. In Japan, the last time I checked, they only are protecting against 9 diseases. So they have had a very long-standing, I wouldn't say opposition, but a lack of fondness for vaccines. They are much more comfortable. If you've ever been to Japan, you get on the subway in Tokyo, like everybody's wearing a mask. It's even well before pandemic. So they have been very comfortable using traditional quarantine. People are very responsible. If you have a sniffly nose, you don't go to school, you don't go to work. It's just part of the culture. And so their vaccine rates for many diseases are very, very low. And they're only often used by expats or people within the private industry, but their disease rates are relatively low as well. They have a very well-funded public health system. They have a very well-funded contact tracing system. So when they have a case of whooping cough, they very quickly track down everybody that's been around that person. Everybody gets a dose of antibiotics, and everybody is put into quarantine for a lengthy period of time and doesn't complain about it, or at least we don't hear them complain about it. So they've taken a very different approach to most diseases. They'll close the country, like they had when we had the H1n1 pandemic here in 2009. We were on our way to Thailand. We had to divert and actually change planes in a different country because they had closed all flights from the United States for a brief period of time because they are very flu phobic. It's a great question, and it's a fascinating just very different approach to things. So who are the folks that are then not getting vaccinated routinely? Well, so these are the unvaccinated adults. So you can see, our bigger groups are obviously these young adults, the 30 to 49-year group. Teenagers have actually been a little bit more willing to do it, and college students, but it's this sort of young working age population. By far, proportionally white individuals are by far the group that are most likely to be unvaccinated. Political party obviously matters a lot. And so, you can see that the uptake in the Republican versus the Democratic Party is really quite dramatic. Higher educational rates, so college educated folks are obviously much more willing to be vaccinated. Those with high school or less are much more likely to be unvaccinated. People were sort of making this out to be something around socioeconomics, but it turns out that it really doesn't fall into what traditionally happens with a lot of infectious disease things, and that it really doesn't seem to be dictated by what people's incomes are. It's really what people's education is and what their politics are. There does seem to be higher uptake in suburban areas, more refusal in suburban areas, but that's also where the majority of the American population lives. So they are also the most vaccinated, and the most non-vaccinated is suburban population. That's just the demographics of how our country is made up. So that's a lot of data for you, but that's sort of just my kind of 10,000-foot view of where we are with this pandemic from an epidemiology standpoint, and sort of how it's played out as far as the importance of vaccines. Now, one of the things that's important, and one of the things that's been most interesting for me as an infectious disease vaccine specialist, is constantly learning every day, all day. And so what are the things we've learned throughout this? So one of the things was we've learned that we can actually do better as far as how we actually, from a regulatory standpoint, develop vaccines and actually bring them to market. So the traditional way vaccines were developed was that there was a lot of preclinical work and lab work that would go on. And until they had something that was a very promising prospect for a vaccine, did they finally get into the phase of then testing it in humans. Phase 1, where they tested in healthy humans and just try to figure out the dose. Phase 2 is they actually see efficacy. Does it actually work to protect against the disease? And then phase 3, where you really get into large scale studies where you can see both, is it safe and how well does it work? And only once you get into this phase where you're sort of really doing large scale experiments, do the companies then start investing money and actually starting to build plants to make the vaccines. So when people keep saying like, well, it takes 8 to 10 years for a new vaccine to come to market, it's because there's, 2 or 3 years of monkeying around here with mice and monkeys and all these things in the lab. And then you sort of march through, and there's often this very extended phase 3, not to see if there's any late side effects. Side effects, we know early side effects happen within a couple of days. Late side effects from a vaccine, the latest a vaccine side effect has ever been truly documented is 2 months. So the only reason that this part sometimes went on for years was to see how long the immunity lasted and how many doses and when did you need boosters. And then the companies would say, okay, it looks pretty promising. Now we're going to put a bunch of cash into making a big factory where we're going to start making this stuff. What the United States government and the European Union did was basically create, which unfortunately got labeled Operation Warp Speed, was a process for basically sort of taking away a lot of this regulatory bottlenecks. By the way, each phase of these, when they would submit data for review before they were given permission by the FDA, could take up to a year of review before they were allowed to go forward. So a lot of this was really, and we've been bitching about this for 20 years, I guarantee you, this is not something anybody's been happy about. So this really gave us an excuse. This was an article from the New England Journal very early in the pandemic, which said, this is ridiculous. This has always been ridiculous. Why does it take so long? We are in the middle of the beginning of a pandemic. Let's figure out a better way to do this. And so one of the things we learned was that if you actually took away the financial disincentive, and so most of the money from the European Union and the US government went to starting to scale up and build plants to be able to have needles and syringes and vials and stoppers and gloves, all the things you need to be able to give the vaccines, and to start to retool some existing manufacturing places so that they actually could be ready as soon as somebody discovered the right vaccine. I mean, to be honest, the very first day when we shut down, by the way, it's the 2-year anniversary, it's amazing, of the beginning of this. And when I was asked on that day to predict how long it was going to go on, I said, this is going to be at least 3 years. And my 3 years was based on that. I thought it was going to take that long. I knew it was going to require a vaccine to get out of it based on the transmissibility and what we were seeing from morbidity. But I honestly thought it was going to take 2 to 3 years to have a vaccine available. The fact that we had vaccines available basically within 6 months, to me, is one of the medical marvels and medical miracles of my lifetime. The fact that we actually figured this out, we already had all this science on the shelf. People have been working on coronavirus vaccines for 20 years. I mean, we had SARS-CoV-1, we had MERS-CoV. People had already been wondering about how to make vaccines against these things. This mRNA technology had been in place for about 20 years, initially designed as cancer vaccines, and Alzheimer's vaccines was what it was originally being tooled for. All of that, all these smart people, all these people that traditionally would have had a lot of turf battles, just said, we're going to collaborate and figure this out together. And the fact that we had vaccines within 6 months, to me, was amazing. The most depressing thing of probably my whole life is the fact that we are still now 2 years into this, and that many people still have not been able to get vaccinated. So what they did was basically said, you do your science, FDA will be waiting at your beck and call. When you have data ready to evaluate, send it and we will evaluate. They had a team on call 24/7. None of this, literally federal statute is that the FDA has 364 days to respond to any data submission before they have to actually rule on it. And I guarantee you, after doing this for almost 30 years, the drug companies usually don't get the answer to move ahead until day 364. That's just the way the system is working. So they figured out, we can figure out this regulatory part, we can start stacking these things. Like, why do you have to do these things one at a time? Why can't you do this and do some of this at the same time? And when you're doing this, already start doing this. And so all of that came together at the same time as then building the manufacturing so that we were able to have vaccines available really quickly. So typically when you get a new vaccine ready for use, the FDA reviews it constantly during the clinical trials. Once it's ready to go, it goes to the vaccine related biological products advisory committee. When you keep hearing about these sort of advisory committees to each of these groups, they're basically the ones that look at all of this as an external review and say, FDA, yep, you did a good job reviewing this stuff. Here's the questions we have. We want to make sure that there's an independent group overseeing the FDA. FDA gives the thumbs up, but then it doesn't even go into arms until the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, then they review it and say, okay, who should actually be getting this vaccine and how should this properly be used? And then CDC approves it. This process often would take up to a year. This now happens in about 2 to 3 weeks when a vaccine is ready to go.
And that'll be true for all future vaccines.
I pray, Paul, that this actually sticks around and that this becomes the new normal, because there has been absolutely no negatives from this process that anybody has been able to think of. I do fear the US government likes to do things the way the US government likes to do things.
But it did cause us to wonder about it, like somebody was faking here and just rushing this thing in.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's the problem. When you label it Operation Warp Speed, I mean, you could have labeled it anything. You could have called it, regulatory reform efficiency. Like, that would have actually been a more accurate term. Like, there were no corners cut. We didn't do the studies any different than we always did them. It's just that we get, and I've run I've run one of the Moderna pediatric studies on campus. I run the AstraZeneca trial. Everything we do, all of my study nurses, they're doing exactly the same stuff they always do. Same tempo, same scheduling. It's just that we get the answers back much more quickly to be able to move on to the next level. It's been a remarkable process to be involved.
So people understand parallel processing in computers as opposed to series.
Yeah, that's exactly what this is.
Yeah.
This was parallel processing as opposed to
Yeah.
series. And they've always run it as a series thing. And we've been asking for 20 years, why? Like, why does it have to have these? And the answer we always get is that because that's how we do it. So it's been a really remarkable, and that's one of the things I think that's interesting to people is that, like, that's been a piece that's been in the background that I hope persists, because it really does a lot. And they've, this idea of emergency use authorization, it's been used for drugs in the past. When somebody comes up with a drug for a disease that there's no treatment, HIV was probably the first example that my first pandemic when I was in medical school. There was a lot of agitation, and Fauci was in charge then too. But you remember all those ACT UP protests saying, why are we going to have to wait 8 to 10 years when there's a viable drug, AZT, that already has been shown in clinical trials to work? And there's some fascinating interviews. And Tony and I went to med school, same med school, different years, but we know each other really quite well. And he's been very upfront about the fact that, like, he dug in his heels way back in the 80s because that's how things were done. And only when people were protesting and saying, why does it have to be this way, was he willing to create this emergency use authorization process to get drugs out faster. This is the first time it's ever been used for vaccines. And that was, again, one of those things that at least people can learn their lessons. The other thing is that, while we've got 3 major vaccines currently available in the United States, I always remind people there are literally hundreds of vaccines constantly in development. There were 250 from within a few weeks of the beginning of the pandemic that people had various models of these things that they were able to get going. So, this is where we are as of just 2 days ago. So there's 31 vaccines that are currently in that phase 1 study. There's 20 that are in combined phase 1 and 2 studies. There's 17 that are in expanded phase 2. There's 12 that are in combined phase 2 and 3. There's 38 that are in these long-term efficacy. 19 have been authorized, 12 have been approved. These are global. So remember, we're just one part of a bubble. And there's been 11 vaccines that have been fully abandoned, that they got to some point of the process, like, nope, this ain't gonna work. There's all sorts of different schedules. There's 1 dosers that some of you mentioned. There's 2 dosers at 2 weeks apart, at 3 weeks apart, at 4 weeks apart. There's 3 doses that are in trials. There's all sorts of different delivery systems that we use for vaccines: under the skin, in the muscle, in the nose, aerosol, inhaled. Everybody is still continuing to work on what's the best vaccine. Yeah.
I'm just curious as to why, if we have 2 that have, the Moderna and the Pfizer look pretty good, and the Johnson had a few issues with younger people. It seems like the puzzle's been solved.
Puzzle's been solved if you're willing to accept what I'm going to talk about in a second,
Okay.
which is good. The question is, are we okay with just good, or do we want great, or do we want perfect? And I certainly, right, and I certainly never, I've learned my lesson over many years of doing this stuff, as you can tell by my abundant blonde hair, that like you never want perfect to be the enemy of good enough, but you also don't want to rest that good is good enough. And so there is another place in there. And so there are lots of companies still working on this. A couple of quick things I mentioned earlier, we've always known a lot about coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are very, very common. So about 20 to 25% of colds every winter are coronaviruses. They're found worldwide. There tend to be more winter, spring type of upper respiratory infections. So this is why people keep talking about if and when it becomes endemic, does it reach a seasonality type behavior like flu does? And the reason they keep saying that is because that's how coronaviruses work. The interesting part is that if I draw blood from all of you before the pandemic, about 90% of you had coronavirus antibodies. That's how common these viruses are. Probably 60% of kids have these coronavirus antibodies. The problem is that the antibodies don't last for very long. And within a few months after you're infected, they start to wear off, which is why unfortunately, we get coronavirus infections over and over and over throughout our lives. Some of them last a little bit longer. So we know from the first 2 SARS pandemics, which both burned themselves out, unfortunately, before they got this bad, that those antibodies, IgG antibodies, actually last a little bit longer. In some situations, maybe up to a year. That was about the longest they were able to show that the natural infection actually provided much immunity. The problem being is that with viruses, you don't necessarily benefit from your immunity in your blood. You need it from where the virus is going to land. Whereas it's going to land on your nose and your throat. And so, unfortunately, very quickly after a coronavirus infection, only between 8 and 31% of people actually are secreting the antibody in their nose and throat, where they need it to actually bind up the virus to protect them from getting infected. So most of the vaccines that we've developed so far, this is why you keep hearing they're really good against hospitalization and death, but they're not that great against infection because they stop getting excreted in the nose and throat. And so that's why you can still get infected with it and still pass it to somebody else, but you may not get super sick because at least you've got antibodies in your blood. So it's good. It's certainly better than nothing. It's certainly better than landing in the hospital, but we still get plenty of people who get sick, and life is a bell curve. So there are unfortunately plenty of people who got vaccinated who lose their antibodies. And so as I showed you, a lot of people that have been vaccinated, unfortunately, with coronavirus Omicron have started to have problems. So how good are these vaccines that we've got so far, and how long does the immunity last? So these are these miracle mRNA vaccines, which granted are currently by far the best ones on the planet. Like I said, there's 12 that are approved, 3 out of Russia, 2 or 3 out of China, a very good one out of India, actually created by a UW graduate from the plant biology program of all things. A really good friend of mine, Krishna Ella. And so there are different vaccines that have popped up in different places, and there's lots that are still in work. But I think without question, the mRNA vaccines are the best of them. When we look at Delta and everything that happened before Delta, so Alpha, Lambda, Beta, at about 2 months, if you had 2 doses, about 92% of people were protected. About 2 to 3 months, you got dropped down to about 88%. And you got out to about 5 months, only about 3/4 of people had what we would consider protective antibody and protective immunity from those vaccines. So good, but not great. Now you boost those people, and you can see you can get these numbers up a little higher. We haven't been boosting people long enough to know how long that's going to last, but you can certainly see that booster did a lot of good. Now, when we look at Omicron and when we look at neutralizing antibody, 2 doses at 2 months only protected about 70% of people. And you can see that as you got out to about 5 months, only about 1/3 of people were protected when we looked at these. And these are emergency department visits, urgent care, and hospitalization. So these are the bad ones. These are sort of things that you really care about. You can see that if you boosted these people, you got pretty decent immunity that lasted quite a while, even against Omicron. But this was why the boosting was so important, and why that lack of a real organized program in the United States to emphasize the importance of boosters and get people to understand you really weren't considered up to date and fully protected without your booster really kind of fell on its face. I think that is one of the major lessons we learned. And we always have to be keeping an eye on this darn variant stuff. These viruses are dumb. They make mistakes all the time. Most of those mistakes are bad mistakes and kill them off. Occasionally they get one that actually does something that's beneficial to them and bad for us. This is the beginning of the pandemic, right after we shut down. And we don't really have a lot of typing on these because we didn't even really understand this typing stuff. So this gray stuff is just other, where there's just not enough data. But what we did see is sort of the initial emergence of certain variants that fortunately the vaccines protected against. And so we were kind of reaching our maximum uptake of vaccines right as a bunch of different mutants were all emerging at the same time. So this is the Lambda mutant. And we really understood, and this is the iota one, this is beta, this is epsilon. So we understood very quickly that if you had a fully immunized or a heavily immunized population, where the US was sort of winning at it, this is all US data, we could actually get this thing shut down for that kind of lull we had early last summer. The problem being that then we kind of took our foot off the brake, let the car get going very quickly and return to normal life. And very quickly we had the emergence of Delta, and then right on the tail of it, Omicron. We're tracking very closely, so that we call this the BA1 Omicron variant. You're starting to hear about the BA2 variant. As of this morning's CDC call that I was on, 11.9% of the variants now in the United States are already the BA2. Seems to behave very similarly to the Omicron, but we're going to just have to watch and see as further mistakes happen. And these things are making mistakes constantly, and especially as they get transmitted in very unvaccinated populations, Africa, some areas of Asia, there's new variants emerging every day. And so we constantly have to be on the watch. And this has now become sort of a national program just to be able to monitor and keep track of these things. One other thing I just wanted to mention, again, in lines with sort of what we talk about is the quality of these of the immunity, is that, and I won't go into, this one's a little bit more sciencey detail than probably people really want to know about, but the easiest things to measure are antibodies. And so that's what everybody's been focused on because they're easy to measure. But what you really actually care about is not the quantity of the antibody, which everybody keeps talking about, but the quality of them. How good are your antibodies that you're making? And so we talk about how good do they actually bind to the virus and how well do they actually neutralize it? What do they do when they actually get to the virus? And so what we've seen as we've seen different variants emerging is that there's sort of this threshold where we don't know how much antibody you need. We guesstimate that you sort of need some amount above this line, and that as the new variants start to emerge, this was the B117 variant, that the neutralization capacity of those antibodies starts to drop off. And so what we started to realize, like, well, we need to boost our immunity at least back up so that they can deal well with these new variants. But we constantly are looking and talking about, like, do we need to actually make a different vaccine that's specifically designated the way we do for flu vaccines every year, where we change the strains and say, gee, I wonder if we actually have enough mutations now that my antibodies from my original vaccine just aren't sticking as well to the virus. Maybe I need to make better sticky antibodies by giving people different vaccines. All right, so where are we currently with our recommendations? So if you're an adult and you got Pfizer, 2 doses is what we call primary series, what the CDC mistakenly called fully vaccinated. Those people need a booster. The current is 3 weeks between their first doses, although for young adults, they're starting to think about stretching this out. And then you get a booster right around that time when we saw that the boosting was needed as the antibodies dropped off and the neutralization goes away. You need a booster 5 months later.
That's
got-
the second booster?
That's your first one. I'm getting to your second one in a second. So this is, you got your first 2 doses and you get 1 booster dose 5 months later. Moderna, same thing. Two primary doses, you get a booster 5 months later. Janssen was a 1 dose booster 2 months. So it's pretty clear that 1 dose wasn't going to be enough. Probably should have been a 2-dose vaccine all along, but they were really looking for a niche to be the one and done vaccine for mobile populations. Understandable. I mean, these guys had already kind of beaten them out of the gate. And so they were kind of looking for where can we help? All these vaccines actually work exactly the same. So I think there's some misunderstanding that one of these is very different, but this is a DNA vaccine. These are mRNA vaccines. DNA gets made into what? mRNA. So these are basically all just variations of an mRNA vaccine. And then the little kids, and you're hearing a lot about this in the news in the last couple of weeks, is people were really concerned about the side effects. And so the little kid 5 to 11-year vaccine is only a third of the dose of the adult dose. And so they get 2 doses. We haven't gotten to boosters yet, but we're already seeing that within a couple months, these kids are susceptible again. So this is the yin yang of it. You lower the dose to get rid of the side effects, but you don't get as much durable immunity. A couple other just things before we open it up to questions. So we've also realized that there are very specific groups of people whose immune systems just don't function like everybody else. So we realized that for both moderately and severe immune compromised people, they actually need a 3-dose primary series. And again, this is where that mistake that they made of calling people fully vaccinated didn't do anybody any good, because you don't even have we've always called it in vaccine world primary series. So immune compromised people needed a 3-dose primary series, and then you boost on that. So they get a total of 4 doses. And their immune systems work so poorly that we recently changed that 5-month interval that most boosters are given and give them now at 3 months. If you got Janssen as your primary vaccine, you get an mRNA boost, but if you're immune compromised, you actually get another mRNA vaccine then. So you actually get 3 total doses. We've also realized that we were doing all these monoclonal antibodies and convalescent plasma. There was a lot of worry that was going to neutralize the vaccine. Turns out it didn't matter, and so we were at least able to lift that. So immune compromised people then are on their completely own schedule. So if you got Pfizer, you get 3 doses of your primary series, then you get a booster 3 months afterwards. So it's no wonder that even the providers and the healthcare systems are getting whiplash again, trying to keep up with how often we have to keep changing this as we learn more about all this. And then I mentioned the kids stuff. Just as a pediatrician, I have to do a solid for my kids. So as I mentioned, the 5 to 11-year-olds got this very small 1/3 of the dose. And what we've unfortunately discovered through the New York State Health Department, where they were the first group to introduce this widely, is that within 2 months during the Omicron surge, the protection dropped from 68% to 12%.
Wow.
And then the effectiveness against hospitalization dropped in just 2 months from 100% to 50%. So pretty clearly dropping that dose meant that we were going to have to actually go with multiple doses and try to figure out a way to keep these kids immune. Now we're doing all these studies in really young kids. Some of you may have heard this sort of excitement that there was maybe going to be a vaccine available for little kids, which they then pulled back because when the external review committee looked at this 3 micrograms, this is 1/10 of the adult dose, 1/3 of what we're given to the bigger kids, 2 doses just wasn't even worth it. And so they had to go back to the drawing board. But this is where, for those of us that sort of don't trust the government, regulatory system worked really well. The review committee looked at it and said, your homework's not done. You go back and you study more. And so they kicked them out and said, you got to do more to actually figure out, does this really work? Now, with that said, it's clear that these are safe. We've now got hundreds of millions of doses of these vaccines that have been given. Kids, even though a lot of parents are reluctant, by the end of December, we had already given almost 9 million doses. It hurts, makes you feel a little bit crummy, but the side effects are pretty mild. And so we at least justified that that's worth doing. I'm going to skip that. And then most recently, and this was news just from a couple of weeks ago, I think you've heard about these concerns about myocarditis or inflammation of the heart after some young adults got the vaccine. I think there's 2 things that are important to understand here. One is if you get COVID itself, myocarditis is actually one of the biggest problems you get from that infection. And so your rates of myocarditis are about 20 to 50 times higher than if you get the vaccine. But it's clear now that if we stretch it out for your 2 doses and make it about 8 weeks, that it decreases this quite a bit. Now, Moderna had actually submitted their data almost 6 months ago, almost 8 months ago now for this teenage group. The Moderna vaccine is about 100 micrograms compared to the Pfizer vaccine, which is about 30 micrograms. So it came out of the gate as a much more potent vaccine, which is why I'm sure you've got friends and family who are like, oh yeah, I got Moderna, I got the good one. So it's clearly got a little bit more durable immunity, but it has more side effects. And so that's the reason it's still not been approved in this adolescent young adult group. And they've actually finally decided to go back to the drawing board and lower the dose. But again, then you get into that yin yang, you lower the dose, then how often are you going to need to do boosters? And so then the $1 million question that you guys want to all know is, what about my next booster? And so it's been sort of an interesting process over these last probably 3 months of a flurry of data that we've been looking at. So first off, as with everything, Israel's always first. As you saw, they were the first group to get vaccine. They were the first group to get wide-scale vaccine. They were the first group to test boosters. They recently gave a large proportion of the population a 4th dose booster, and the data was pretty disappointing. That it sort of took your boosted antibody level up a little bit, but when you got 1 dose, got 1 dose and 2 doses, and it kind of fade. You gave 1 booster, you got up to here. They gave a 4th booster, and maybe nudged it up a little bit. And so they realized that it was relatively disappointing, at least for kind of the general population. Probably don't need that 4th booster. I think it's pretty clear that eventually we're going to need to give more boosters to this immune compromised population. And I think that there's more and more evidence, again, based on the data I showed you about who's bearing the brunt of this and who continues to get hospitalized. With 95% of individuals over age 65 having gotten at least 1 dose, and yet with the Omicron surge, that's the population that's largely the ones still ending up in the hospital. I think it is pretty clear that there's going to need to be probably a 4th dose booster for that population. What age group is actually very interesting. So, Norway decided they were going to start a 4th dose booster, but they're doing 80-year-olds and above. And many countries are sort of adopting that as kind of the highest boost group. In the United States, because of Medicare and Medicaid and CMS stuff, we've kind of always used 65 as the cutoff for most things. And so that's where the discussions are. And then again, if we do get a brand new variant that the current vaccines don't protect against, Omicron, unfortunately, they protected pretty well against, we may need a new vaccine for everybody and give everybody a booster for that. But overall, the general consensus at this point, especially for sort of the healthy population of 12 to 50-year-olds, is that even though those antibody levels drop, these magical T cells that are actually the memory part of your immune system, they're the ones that remember stuff for you, are still there in the background and still waiting and still working quite well. And so while we want all of this population to get a booster, the odds that they're going to need another booster to remind their immune system is pretty small at this point. Now, it's going to be tricky because when you make recommendations that are only good for one part of the population but not for the other, it just adds confusion to the whole thing. But that's at least what the science is telling us right now. Last couple of things. People always debate about these lovely masks that we're all wearing, but I think it's pretty clear that there's plenty of data that depending on if you're in the middle of an outbreak and you're not immune, a cloth mask decreases your risk of testing positive about 50%. One of these surgical masks takes you to about 65%. And then these N95s and KN95s protect about 85% of people. So they certainly are clearly useful and have great utility in certain settings. If everybody was vaccinated, they probably wouldn't be as important as they are, but I think the debate on masks is well over. Last couple of things just as sort of kind of gee whiz stuff. So when we're looking at ways to motivate people that aren't vaccinated, there's been a couple of things that have come out just in the last few weeks. This is from one of my alma maters at Northwestern. If you start talking about guys and their junk, like that's a pretty quick way of getting them interested in getting vaccinated. Another is these papers that came out just in the last couple of days about brain shrinkage. And this, I think, is both a little bit alarming and still needs to be sorted out. But essentially what they looked at was areas of the brain on MRIs. And in people that had not been vaccinated who got COVID, they had fairly substantial, these are the red is the cases, fairly substantial drop off. This is amount of loss of brain. This is the quantity. They had fairly substantial loss of brain gray matter. And some of the calculations that the media was using was basically that a single COVID infection that was severe enough to get you hospitalized basically gave you the amount of atrophy of your brain of about 10 years of aging. So, if that doesn't motivate that last 11% of the over 65 population that still haven't gotten vaccinated, I don't know what will.
So that still took 6 months to get through review.
Yeah. Yeah, that was because it was pretty controversial. And they made them go back and actually do some additional study points because they wanted to make sure that they had confidence intervals that were supportable, because it's a pretty, groundbreaking and kind of earth-shattering concept, because I think a lot of people think about this kind of brain fog after they've had COVID, and there's this sort of long COVID stuff. And a lot of it, I think people put it into the same buckets that we put like chronic fatigue syndrome in, which, used to be blamed on mono. And then it turns out basically anything that lays you flat on your back for a while, you decondition, and it can allow you to become chronically fatigued. The chronic fatigue of long COVID is very unique. And so people at first were sort of lumping it into you were sick and you're kind of deconditioned. And then it was, well, this is just the most inflammatory virus we've seen in so long. Maybe it's all this leftover inflammation that's doing this to people. And so what these, let me turn it backwards here. Oh yeah. So what these studies are, part of why they're rocking everybody's world is that this isn't just inflammation from your immune system you turn on. This is actually virus getting into these tissues and destroying stuff itself.
It's not autoimmune.
It's not autoimmune. So these seem to be genuinely viral pathogenic effects, as opposed to what most viruses do, which affect one part of your body, turn on your immune system, and then it kind of messes you up. So again, this is all needs to be replicated over and over again before I believe it, but it's at least intriguing and starting to explain some of that. And then I'll just finish up with a couple. If you really want more information on this stuff, we work with a non-governmental organization currently headquartered in Minnesota called the Immunization Action Coalition. They have the greatest and simplest website, which is just www.immunize.org. And we basically, for those of us that work on this kind of stuff, put everything we develop, all sorts of PowerPoints and educational materials. We kind of park them here. They've curated just an amazing collection of materials. Excuse me. Including links to all the best CDC sites. Sorry. I inhaled one of these little hairs because I was too lazy to get a new mask in the morning, one of my old ones. They get all frayed on the inside. Yeah. I just aspirate one of those. So hopefully somebody knows first aid so they can resuscitate me if I go down here in a second. So, bottom line is, as I predicted early, vaccines were going to be our answer to this mess. Vaccines clearly have worked out better than we thought they might. And it's just a matter of trying to convince people. But also, I think it's a matter of trying to figure out better ways to clarify for people what the guidance is, what the current recommendations are, because it's been hard. My colleagues all the time, my in-basket is filled constantly with physicians and nurses asking for clarification about how do I deal with this patient? How do I do it? So if they're asking and can't keep it straight, I don't know how the general public is able to do this. I do think there needs to be more unified messaging and more consistent messaging that basically says exactly what people do. The only biggest problem that I told Tony Fauci that I was concerned about was that one of the things I think that happened early on and then continued through the pandemic, as we learned more, we had to change the recommendations. And unfortunately, that became people saying, I don't trust you because you said this before. And like when we said, we don't think everybody needs to wear masks. And then, you know what? It turns out it's an aerosol respiratory virus. It's not like most respiratory viruses, which are droplets, where masks don't matter. They needed to just say the words, we know we told you not to wear masks. We were wrong. Now we really think you need to do this. If they had just, I think your parents told you, just admit that you know what you said, but instead they just came out well, this is what we've been saying all along. It made everybody feel and they were you. And so this has been, I think, part of the problem with the messaging of this is that people don't understand how science works, that until something is replicated and happens over and over, do you truly trust it? And that as we learn things, we have to keep modifying in public health. That's not how people are used to doing this. And with the internet, where everything's right there, like, I mean, I get every time a preprint of an article comes out, you know, I get 30 text messages from my friends like, oh, see, look at this. I'm like, calm down until we can replicate that a couple of times. I don't know that that's true or not. And more often than not, it turns out not to be true. But the media and the internet just loves to jump on those things. And so I think it's been understandably very confusing for people. I think we're doing a better job gradually over time, but the other big problem is that our public health system is so fragmented because every state has its own version of these things, its own messaging. And so, you know, I've talked all through the pandemic about, unfortunately, the balkanization of our public health system, that every state has different rules, every county has different rules, and it doesn't make any sense to people. You know, if all these counties don't have a mask rule, but this one does, like, how does that make sense to
Yeah, you go shopping for where you can do things.
Yeah, it's just been very, very challenging. It's been exciting,
For
but
someone who got COVID early, when do they get vaccinated, or should they get vaccinated?
yeah, they absolutely need to be vaccinated. So as I showed, you know, the natural immunity really doesn't last very long. The immunity from the vaccines at least is a little bit better, more neutralizing, and lasts a little bit longer. So it's absolutely clear that, and we've got a kid in the hospital right now, he's got his third COVID infection, unvaccinated. Parents still refuse to vaccinate him. But it's clear that natural immunity doesn't last very long.
So he's had COVID 3 times.
3 times.
And he's in the hospital.
And he's hospitalized with the third one, in the intensive care unit.
We're giving them.
Totally healthy, normal kid. Totally healthy, normal kid. No immune, when we worked up his immune system after the second time, totally normal immune system. He had it very early, then he had it about a year later, and now he's about 8 months out from that one. So it's very clear that natural immunity doesn't actually protect nearly the way we would like it to.
Back to the J&J, I got one in March. I got a Pfizer booster in October.
Stay tuned. You're good for now, and then, I mean, as long as you're not immune compromised, you're considered sort of protected enough for now, and then we'll kind of get back to you.
Because I wouldn't mind, you know, going and getting another one.
I know everybody wants.
They're throwing them out.
Yeah,
I think the major problem is the politicization of the opposition. And that you can't do anything about it, right?
it's hard to undo it, you know, as my mom told me when I was young, you only have one chance to make a first impression. And so when, you know, major political leaders on either side, you know, make a particular statement, that becomes their stance then. And they very rarely are willing to contradict themselves. And so that is, it's a tragedy in my mind, you know, that's been allowed to go forward. You know, and it's just so interesting because, you know, they've made opposition to the masks and opposition to the vaccine part of the platform, and yet the vast majority of them have actually been fully vaccinated. You know, so it's really, you know, in some ways an injustice to sort of say one thing and do another, and to try to encourage
But
people.
the statistics you had on Democrats versus Republicans doesn't look like the majority have been vaccinated.
No, I'm talking about the leadership, the people that have been saying these things. When we have very good evidence and very good data that the vast majority of them have gone and gotten themselves vaccinated. At the same time, they're telling people it's your right to choose and all these kinds of things. I mean, it's irresponsible at best, I think. Yeah.
Well, just first on that, I would call it a cynical ploy for power. But the actual question I had was, and it was interesting that you brought up that young man who seemingly healthy but has had it more than once. Is anyone doing research on why some people are more prone to getting it than others? I mean, like I never get colds. I have a cold maybe every 6 or 7 years, and obviously in the last 2 years wearing this,
Yeah, right.
like awesome.
It's a good look on you too.
Yeah, it hides the wrinkles. Really.
Yeah, no, that is a fascinating
But
area
I'm
of study.
wondering
And actually
about
here at
that.
the UW, there's a lot of people that are very, very interested in that. It's clear that there are certain genetic factors that predispose people to certain conditions. You know, for instance, strep throat. Strep throat, like strep needs a certain antigen that some people have on their cells and some people
Yeah.
don't. Like I've never had strep throat in my whole life. I had 2 girlfriends when I was younger who had wicked strep throat, and I guarantee you I was doing stuff that should have justified me getting strep throat. Not a glimmer of it.
Yeah.
So it is clear that there are people that have, and the certain organisms have what's called a tropism, where they actually are looking for certain molecules. Some people have them, some people don't. You've heard of blastomycosis, which is, obviously very common in Wisconsin. There is a particular group of Hmong people that have a genetic predisposition, totally healthy otherwise. Their immune systems are totally normal. This has been published by some of my colleagues, who are very susceptible to blastomycosis. And so
What is blastom?
it's a fungus that lives in beaver dams and kind of wet soil around rivers. And we happen to be the blasto capital of the world here in Wisconsin. So it's very common up in like Rhineland or Eagle River, and then out in Black Earth and those kinds of areas, and kind of moist, damp areas. So it's a fungus that many of us get exposed to. I go camping and hiking all the time. Never had it. And so it does turn out that there are very specific things. And so there are people, including people that work with COVID patients, even before there were vaccines, that never got COVID. There's other people that get a whiff of it and get COVID. So people are looking, same thing with HIV. There's the CL5 marker that you can get exposed to HIV. If you don't have this one marker, there are actually people that are technically immune to HIV because they don't have the marker where the virus actually binds onto. So people are looking at a lot of, the hard part with these viruses, they make so many mistakes that it's actually so many different viruses. And so you got to kind of decide, and that's one of the things we've wondered about, because we're pretty sure that this kid that has had it 3 times, I'm pretty sure he had probably alpha strain in the very first wave, probably had lambda strain with the other one, and then he had Omicron. And so the question is are each of those viruses different enough? Or, so was it something about him, or was it just that their immunity, again, with natural immunity that fades away in 2 months, he may have just been completely non-immune by the time he got there, but why did the virus actually attack him? We're still working on that.
Are there studies that are trying to detect how long the immunity lasts?
Yeah, all these vaccine studies and then all these disease studies, there are huge cohorts of people that get blood drawn very regularly. And actually the UK just did a fascinating study that we were shocked that they got approval. They actually did intentional exposure of young adults, both vaccinated and unvaccinated, where they actually intentionally squirted coronavirus up their nose to actually be able to mark on a daily basis, how much virus do you shed on at this hour, at this hour, at this hour, when does this antibody kick in? So they did a very small cohort, I think 25 or 30 people. But the fact that the IRB even approved, essentially, it's a treatable condition now. So I think that was finally what got them over the hump. But we're still learning all those things about how long do you shed certain viruses, who sheds more, who sheds less, how soon does their immunity kick in, how long does it last? All those things are being studied constantly.
That's going to be pretty hard to make conclusions on a study of 25. And
Yeah. But it's at least kind of a proof of concept that you could at least get a ballpark.
Yeah, but then you get 25,000, 25 million, and you're going to get rare events that are going to
Need a lot of money for that.
Talk about long COVID.
Long COVID? Yeah, so that's what I was talking about. Long COVID, people are still studying it, but it does seem that the virus infects more tissues than people realize that it could. And so what the theories are, there's 2 theories. One is that people with long COVID just takes them longer to clear the virus. And so the virus persists in their tissues for longer. And they may have some predisposition where their immune system may either continue to overreact or continue to cycle. The immune system has so many different pieces that are all telling each other what to do. And so there are some people where it's clear that it's almost like they create an autoimmune condition themselves, where their immune system keeps sort of turning itself back on unnecessarily. But that seems to be one subgroup. And so what the current theories are is that there's actually probably lots of different versions of long COVID. There's a traditional kind of chronic fatigue. I just got whacked, it's going to take me a while to be reconditioned. There's some people that may actually have a chronic viral infection, and there's some people that may have this cycling immunologic thing, but still being sorted out because most of the people are just so different from each other. Yeah.
Is the data collection good enough to establish correlation between long COVID and your vaccination status?
It's pretty solid that if you're vaccinated and boosted, that your risk of both hospitalization and long COVID is almost 0. There have been some people who had their primary vaccination and then never got boosted who got COVID, who seem to have at least a version of long COVID, but it doesn't seem to be as severe. Again, the hard part is sorting out how Delta and Omicron act compared to Alpha, Beta, and Lambda. And so I think they're still trying to figure out, are the viruses different enough that they cause different things? And obviously, since Omicron and Delta were just recent, it is going to probably take another year or two to determine how much long COVID they cause, and was it more or less than they had before.
We got a question online. Do you think that we will require an annual vaccine for COVID?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. I mean, at this point, I'd say that it's likely that for some populations, for older individuals and for immune compromised patients, I think that as the virus is going to be at least endemic on the planet for a while, I think it's very likely that those populations will get another booster. I think the question is going to be, does everybody need one? Because, in reality, the booster, is much more important for certain populations than for others. From a convenience standpoint, the decision might get just made to just give it to everybody, because why not?
The flu.
Yeah, like the flu. But I think it's still to be determined. There's a lot of groups, I'm on some of them, that are kind of looking at that and, trying to decide, how do we make that decision? And I think the jury's still out on that. There's a couple of vaccine companies that are working on combined flu COVID vaccines, so that they're going to be ready if we say, it'd be great if everybody just got another dose this fall, that we could just combine it with your flu vaccine and make it easy. But we just don't know if this is even going to be endemic in the way traditional coronaviruses are, where it's a winter and spring thing, or like who would have expected we would have had a major upsurge in July and August, right? So it's a little hard to say if we need an annual one, and the other hard question is when. Do you do it based on the timing of when you got your last booster, or do you do it because I think it's a little bit of a wishful thinking to think we figured this out enough to be able to predict that it's going to be a fall and winter, or a winter and spring disease. I think we just need to, time will tell us. It's a great question.
Or one of the companies here in Madison that are doing that combined flu.
There's one company that's working on a novel vaccine here. I don't know if they've got a combined.
Okay.
They might. I mean, Yoshi's group
Yeah.
is working on an experimental model, and they work with this group in India as the manufacturing. So they're working on the scientific side of it, but I don't know if they're actually manufacturing it here in town or not.
I want to ask about Bambi. Oh, sorry. Go
Are there predictive tools to anticipate future infectious variants, either for vaccination or for?
Yeah, it's a great.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, the question is, are there ways to do surveillance and predict future variants? So there are ways to predict what variants are possible. As they kind of pass the virus over and over again through certain animal cell lines or through actual animals, you can sort of see which way certain mutations go. Most of the primary mutations are obviously on the spike glycoprotein, which is also where most of the vaccines are targeted. What we haven't seen yet is major mutations in other parts of the virus. And those are a lot more unpredictable, because it only takes, one mistake as these things copy themselves in a novel part of the virus. Most of those mistakes they make just kill the virus, but anything's possible. And we certainly see with HIV, people are cranking out constant mutations. So there's certainly ways to predict the types of mutations that can happen. Which ones will happen, nobody's been able to figure out. There's no real way of looking at the types of mutations and predicting which ones are actually going to be good for the virus. The Omicron, it seems to have been, certainly made it more transmissible and made it more transmissible more quickly. So from a virus, kind of an ecology fitness standpoint, that's awesome for the virus, because people are shedding it before they even know they're sick. They're shedding it much earlier than they were before. So it makes it a lot more likely that it's going to spread really widely. So if you're a virus, you're like, yes, I got this. What the virus, wasn't able to do was also become super virulent. But that's what we really get worried about, is you get a double mutation where it becomes more contagious and more virulent. And so we can predict from a modeling standpoint all the possibilities of the mutations that might occur, but it's hard to predict which ones are actually going to take hold and sort of take off. And so that's the reason that the mRNA vaccines in particular are really well suited for this, because all you need is the mutant, and you need the sequence of that new mutant genome. You plop it in, they can have vaccine out in mass quantities within 2 to 3 months. So that's the beauty of that part of the technology. I think that's going to be, in many ways, sort of the new version of vaccines for lots of things. I mean, that company, both of those companies are working on, improved flu vaccines. I mean, flu vaccines, yeah, they're 80% protective against getting in the hospital, but on a good year, they're maybe 50% protective against actually getting the flu. And so we've been willing to live with that. It's good enough. But like this technology of being able to like fine tune it, because the problem with flu vaccine, like we have to decide in January. So they're made in eggs, they have to grow up in a virus. Like we have to decide in January what we think the circulating strains are going to be in November. Like that's not great science. If I could decide in June or in July and then still have it available for people in September and October, like that's a win. So I think that's where a lot of this new vaccine technology is going to get us, is much more nimble ability to either update the vaccines or develop new ones quickly. And that's obviously now we've all hopefully learned our lesson from now my fourth pandemic in my life, that we really need to be watching for these things, doing a lot more surveillance. We've ramped up quite a bit. When the pandemic was kind of, in the fall, only about 2% of all the strains were actually even being variant typed. And so, now we're up to the point in Wisconsin, we have 5 labs that do variant testing on a daily basis. In the midst of the Omicron surge, we were actually testing about 10% of the positives to see which variant they were. Now that's good, but it's still 90% we're not testing.
In that regard, are they working on an Omicron specific vaccine?
Already done.
And how does that work backwards on the other variants?
Yeah, so both Pfizer and Moderna, wait, this is top secret. Oh, well, too late. So yes, both of them actually have already made the vaccines, have already tested them. They work well. What they don't have enough evidence for yet, because the other viruses are gone, is how well they still work if the other original viruses pop up and show up, because they're still circulating in other areas of the world. So one of the things that they're actually working on is combined vaccines like we have for flu. Flu has 2 A strains, it has an H3N2, it has an H1n1, it has 2 different B strains. So they're actually working on combination COVID vaccines that have like some Omicron in it and some original Wuhan alpha strain. And so that's kind of one of the models, if we need it, that is ready to go if we say we need it. Yeah.
I have some self-interest, but why are older people more susceptible?
It's $1 million question, with the answer being a combination of things. One is what we call immune senescence. So unfortunately, as you get older, your immune system just gets a little bit more tired and a little bit less responsive. That's why all the flu deaths are in people over age 65. That's why all of those things happen in that group. Second reason is that there's so many comorbidities. So they're underlying medical conditions. So chronic heart disease and chronic lung disease, you throw in a really bad virus on top of it that causes lung and heart problems, and that's the population that's going to suffer the most. So it's a combination of basically immune senescence plus the underlying comorbidities that really set people up for these things. Yeah.
I just read that white-tailed deer in the Pennsylvania area are infected, and I can see how they affect each other because they nuzzle. However, it made me really interested because all January and part of February, I had a deer in my backyard eating the cedar trees.
Damn thing.
And yeah, she's eating.
I'm glad you got them, because I got 5 in my backyard that are doing that
In the
too.
meantime, she's also, every 2 feet, there's a big pile of scat along the whole yard. And of course, her route when she leaves. Now, if that deer was infected, what risk is it to me when I go and clean up that scat?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm actually, we're putting on a conference. One of my neighbors is the president of the Wisconsin Veterinary Medical Association, and one of my best friends runs the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. And it was really interesting when this was first picked up some months ago. It was sort of one of those, oh, that's interesting that some of these viruses apparently have gotten into some of the deer, and it seemed to have started at some of these deer farms. And so it was oh, that's interesting. Most animals are susceptible to coronaviruses. So it was one of those kind of gee whiz things. And then it became clear that it's spreading within the deer population. So there's plenty of deer. Iowa has got a lot of data. Pennsylvania is the one that's been doing it the most. Here, they're starting to do some testing in Wisconsin too, because they test for chronic wasting disease. So people kind of give up the heads. And so there's a group that's been looking at those. And so it turns out it can circulate between deer. And then very recently, just in the last couple of weeks, it has been documented. It looks like there can actually be transmission from deer to humans. And
Oh,
so, yeah, and so there's a whole group that are coming together very quickly, because one of the things we worry about most, when you have a disease that's endemic within the human population, you at least have a chance of being able to control it if everybody gets vaccinated, stays home when they're sick, wears a mask, all those things. So we could have gotten rid of this. But when you have an animal reservoir where the virus can then hide out and then reemerge, that makes it a lot harder to eradicate a disease. And so that's actually one of the concerns about this deer stuff. So it doesn't happen commonly that we know of yet, but this story is literally being written day by day.
So she's asking,
how do deer transmit it to humans?
I mean, all of these viruses get transmitted by the respiratory route. So whatever hunters do, I'm not a hunter, so I'll have to plead some ignorance, but whatever hunters do when they're out dealing with their deer after they kill them must get them into close enough contact with either secretions or blood that they somehow get themselves inoculated. I mean, it's rare. There's only one case that I'm aware of that
So
where
you're not concerned about the ones in your backyard?
I'm concerned that they keep eating my damn trees. I've tried wrapping them in burlap and I've tried spraying them with pepper stuff and nothing
That
seems
just
to.
makes them taste better.
I know, it's driving me crazy, but I mean, life is full of risks. If that's how I go, I'll take it, because that's just weird. So I'm not alarmed by it, but I'm interested in it as a scientist, and it makes me a little concerned that it may be harder to get rid of this disease than we had hoped it might.
we have another online question. What is the correlation between being in a red state and a blue state and the incidence of COVID?
Yeah, whoever that is referring to an article that just came out in the New York Times this morning, actually.
I read it before I came.
Yeah, which is, I start the morning every morning reading a number of briefings, and then the New York Times has done a spectacular job of, I mean, that's why I have so many other graphics, just because they're so useful in accumulating disease. The answer is it's not as clear as people think it should be because there's so many variables. So overall, it holds up better at the county level than it does at a state level. So, unfortunately, like in a state, very few states are homogeneous across the entire state. Like we're technically a reddish state currently, and yet we've got these like serious pockets of blue. So it's really sort of a little bit spurious to sort of try to paint them by just like who'd the votes go for, Biden or Trump. So it's a lot more complicated than that. The other thing is that it's not just a matter of, these diseases are not binomial. It's not you either have the disease or you don't. It's you have the disease and you have a serious version, or you have the disease and you have a mild version, or you have no disease. And that's actually, I think, where the more valid comparisons are. So we clearly know that in the red counties, the death rates are dramatically higher correlated to the low vaccination rates. And the infection rates during periods of time when people are still mitigating, avoiding dining out, wearing masks and all those things, are clearly well controlled. What they're referring to is that there's some data in some areas, Maine being the most recent one, where when states that were very strict, unrestricted and kind of go back to normal, that the vaccine rate is their only protection, that there's no natural immunity of people that have actually gone and gotten the disease. And so there's this temporary window where they're actually a more vulnerable state if they fully lift masks and go back to normal. And so that's sort of some of the information that's being thrown back at people because the death rate is very clear if you're unvaccinated, and those are very closely correlated. But the New York Times tried to do this analysis. It's very complicated. I encourage you to take a look at it and read it and try to figure out what it is they're getting at. But the problem is there's so many variables, because it's not just your vaccine rate, it's not just your masking rate, it's what your public health measures have been, it's what your testing rates are. So in blue areas, testing is a lot more prevalent. People are much more willing to get tested. So some of it's also a sampling error where the number of cases doesn't necessarily mean there are more cases. It just means there's more cases that have been detected. So that's what they're getting at. And the answer is, in general, it really still comes down to your vaccine rate.
I think it also comes down to the strength of the public health system. Confession, I retired from DHS, Department of Health Services, but I think that's one of the things that are, generally in a lot of the red states that are having higher outbreaks. There isn't a public health, a strong and vital public health infrastructure within the state. So I think it just exacerbates the impact of each individual person who comes down with something. And in a lot of the blue states, there's just a much stronger infrastructure for public health that can come in, that can instantly spring into action when there's an event like a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it's well taken. It's complicated because, as they say, all politics is local, and so we have our kind of national public health structure, which is clearly inadequate and has been thought to be for many, many, many years. CDC is really good at responding to things, but it's not an integrated system. Every state has its own system. And even with that, every county has its own system, and sort of where your funding comes from and then how you decide to use it is really up to the local expertise. And so there's actually very inconsistent, even within certain states. In California, some of the counties were very adamant about contact tracing, isolation, and enforcement. Others put all their eggs into making testing readily available for schools. And so you really have to figure out, like, where do I put our people? So we put a lot of our people, we didn't actually do that much contact tracing in Dane County, to be honest, because we put a lot of resources into opening up the Alliance Center and having it well staffed all the time. So people get tested as soon as they wanted to. And then as soon as we had vaccines, to make vaccines widely available. So it was just, I'm not judging. It was just a decision that was, let's prioritize getting people tested so that they have actionable information, and we'll get vaccines available as quickly as possible. And we'll make contact tracing sort of a secondary thing that will essentially ask people to do it on their own. So if you had a positive test out of the Alliance Center, they called you and said, please tell everybody you've been around and, tell them what to do. But they didn't take other counties took all their resources and wanted to do. So it gets complicated. Yeah.
Can you talk about aerosol vaccines? Have any been developed or approved? And what's the pipeline?
Yeah, so aerosol vaccines have been a very interesting phenomenon. So if you think about these types of respiratory viruses, they're transmitted by aerosol. So the idea is, let's do something that actually mimics the natural infection. Some of you may know about a flu vaccine called FluMist, or LAIV, which is it's not an inactivated, but it's an attenuated virus. So it's a wimpy version of the flu virus. And especially in children who are naive to flu, who haven't had previous flu disease or flu vaccines, it gives them a very, very, very mild case of flu, but it gives you your immunity where you want it, which is in your mucosa, in your nose, so that you're essentially excreting antibodies and have your immune T cells all revved up and ready to go. So if an aerosol virus lands there, you're prepped and ready to go. And it kind of makes sense because, like, most vaccines, you put it into a muscle because it's the biggest area of the body that can accommodate volume. But the muscle is got probably the least amount of immune cells of any part of the body. So it's always been sort of a kind of a silly approach. And so that's why a lot of these vaccines that I was sort of talking about, kind of on the new side of it, are looking at different ways of delivering. So there's a lot of immune cells in the skin. And so giving them either under the skin or into the skin itself, but these in nasal and aerosol. And so there's only one true aerosol vaccine that's in development. There's more on the nasal and inhaled versions that are kind of variations on a theme. And so the goal is that you try to create something that is wimpy enough that it can't cause disease, but likely to actually be able to stimulate immunity. None of them have been approved yet in the United States, but this is a model that people are more and more interested in. Whooping cough is another one. I was on a project, there's a European group that's working on an intranasal attenuated whooping cough, where you get that first, then you get your shot to kind of boost your immunity and give you more solid immunity. It actually seems to protect much better against pertussis. So there's sort of, most of these are kind of in early phase development, but there is some promise. I think the hard part is that how you have to attenuate these things so much so that they don't cause disease, and does that still allow them to replicate enough? And so it's a really fine space. And with a virus that we're still learning about and trying to keep up with its mutations, I think people are still a little nervous about these. And so most of these are still in the animal model phase or in early human phase testing at this point. They haven't really sort of reached the point of being ready for prime time.
Have you have you heard about the mini protein binders that are, I think are now in clinical trial?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that people are trying, both on the vaccine side, vaccine side, as we talked about, like these mRNA vaccines are really good. They're just not great yet. They just don't give you, we would love a vaccine, just like we'd love a flu vaccine, you only have to get every 10 years. It's a pain in the ass to get it every year. So there's been a lot of work at trying to figure out a way to get more durable immunity. A lot of work with that is using things called adjuvants to try to stimulate the immune system to either respond better or to respond in a different way. So you get multiple pieces of the immune system turned on. There's different versions of drugs that people are developing. They're developing monoclonal antibodies to treat. They're developing antivirals. And then they're trying to sometimes couple these things together. So there's some, I forget there's a new name for them now, but there's these nanoparticle vaccines that they're using where they put a whole bunch of different pieces of the virus, of the antigens of the virus, and then use immune stimulators to sort of drive different parts of the immune system. And so that's kind of some of these. Those are actually, some of them are subcutaneous vaccines. And again, this is, while we've got a pretty good answer, I think people are still in the mindset that we can do better, and we probably will need to do better if this is going to be an endemic disease, because immunizing 8-point-something billion people on the planet every year, is impossible. So we need something that we can give people that actually covers them for 5 or 10 years, and that has robust immunity that protects against all different variations. And there's actually more interest in it usually than there. Most vaccine stuff is pretty niche. There's up until recently been a pretty limited number of companies that were interested in this. Only in the last 10 years have biotech, small startups, largely spin-offs of university research programs, gotten started to actually start tackling neglected tropical diseases or diseases that people thought, we kind of had them licked. Oh, wait, they're back. Maybe we can come up with a better version of these things. So you're going to be hearing about this stuff for a while, about all these different approaches that people are taking.
Talk to me, if you would, you may not, about the Surgeon General of the state of Florida.
Deep cleansing breath. Another deep cleansing breath. From a polite standpoint, everybody's entitled to their opinion. From a responsibility standpoint, any public official has a responsibility to the public to share both accurate information and information that is likely to let them at least make decisions that are likely to be best for themselves. By expressing opinion that is contrary to general science, so what he's talking about is basically Surgeon General in Florida saying that healthy children shouldn't get the vaccines. Full stop. Like, that was his entire statement. Very little explanation other than they're unnecessary, and secretly people are wondering, are they just not willing and interested in paying for it or making it a thing? But really probably speaking to a certain part of the political spectrum that wants choice about everything and wants to be able to pick and choose what they do. But it doesn't do anybody any good if you're expressing opinion without at least recognizing that your opinion is an outlier. And so I think it's relatively irresponsible. I think the CDC is trying to wrestle with, what do? They certainly have limited power to be able to, the feds can't require anything, the states to do anything as far as school entry requirements for vaccines or anything like that. So those are clearly state powers. And his other argument is that since the children's vaccines are still under emergency use authorization, that his argument is that because some of them, at least the young under age 12, are not fully FDA approved, that people should have the right to not get those vaccines until they're fully approved. But when he comes out and states that healthy children shouldn't get them, that's his opinion. Like I said, he's entitled to his opinion privately, but that's not the type of opinion that a responsible leader should be expressing. I mean, I may have crazy opinions about all sorts of things that are perfectly my right to have, but as soon as I'm in a position of authority as a professor at the university, I kind of lose that right as somebody who's considered a key opinion leader or a decision maker to share things that are outside the mainstream. It's about as polite as I can be about it.
And his boss, the governor, DeSantis, famously,
Who occasionally calls himself the future president of the United States.
well, some of us have been hit by the humility stick. he famously directed young people standing behind him at a video photo op to take the masks off. They don't do anything.
Yeah.
Is there a basis that a medical person should rebuff that? And who's appointed by DeSantis and who should know better that masks actually do something? Here's the data on that.
The Surgeon General.
I mean, you would hope that behind, I mean, you know, as we say, you know, the election cycle is forever now. You know, we used to have these very nice windows. Like, I wish I lived in France. France has, by law, 2 weeks of campaigning. Campaigning outside of 2 weeks, you get fined. I love that. Let's just all spend 2 weeks thinking about politics and then spend the other 40, 50 weeks like thinking about sports. We're thinking about cheese and wine. It would be awesome. But the election cycle is constant now. And so these people are constantly looking for, you know, ways to endorse to their supporters, you know, that they're on their side. You know, I think that, you know, our best as an American public, I mean, our best recourse in these things is to vote these people out. And for, you know, certainly there are medical community. The Florida Pediatrics Association was on a call I was on yesterday, and they are, you know, writing editorials. They are actively, you know, sort of trying to do what they can to rebuff some of these messages. But that's the problem when, you know, as was mentioned before, when public health becomes political, you know, there's a reason that the Geneva Convention says that the Red Cross and anything that has to do with medical care is outside the boundaries of what's considered part of the military theater. And we have said for many years, public health should be agnostic and apolitical. You know, and it's both sides. I mean, one of the things, you know, the Obama administration used the polio campaign in Afghanistan as a means of trying to find bin Laden. The backlash of that, the number of vaccine workers that were killed in Pakistan and Afghanistan because it was found out that they were using vaccinators, ostensibly giving vaccines, basically collecting DNA evidence to try to find the bin Laden family, was absolutely unacceptable. Every public health school in the entire country wrote an open letter to the Obama administration and said this should never have been allowed to happen, and this should never be allowed to happen ever again. In their mind, it was justified because this was, you know, enemy number one. But we made it very clear to them that that should never be something that should ever be in play. The same kind of thing happens with this. It was absolutely wrong when public health became political football, you know, running up into this last election, and that should never be acceptable for anybody. You know, public health in most countries is considered completely separate, has separate budgets, like the military budget. Ours is tied up now, unfortunately, in this politics. Never had seen it before 20 years ago in my mind, but it's always been there. It's always been part of all of our public health programs, unfortunately. I got to get back to work soon. I love talking about this stuff, but I just realized. Yeah, one more.
Okay. About vaccine certificates, do they seem to have any impact in the countries that they use them widely?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting that you know, when we think about public health, it's often comparing a carrot and a stick. You know, and so there's vaccine requirements that people push back about because they don't want to be told what to do. And then there's vaccine certificates that actually get you to be able to do something. One of the most interesting things we saw in Dane County was that when some of the concert venues reopened, the Sylvie, the High Noon, the Orphe, no, the Orphe, no.
Oak did.
They basically put in a vaccine requirement to be able to get, you had to be fully vaccinated by the CDC to be able to get into a concert. We saw appointments for 18 to 35-year-olds in Dane County at the Alliance Center for vaccines skyrocket. Same thing happened in Milwaukee when they reopened the Pabst, the Riverside, and one of the other ones, and they said they were going to require vaccines. Suddenly, and again, that's one of the largest groups of unimmunized people. And their philosophy is like, this isn't that bad in my age group. I'm pretty healthy. I'll be fine. That's a pain in the neck to go get the vaccine. It's not worth my trouble. As soon as you make it worth their trouble, you can get in and do things that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. Boom. So in France, where you had to have a vaccine certificate to be able to go into a restaurant, they had no problems in the young adult population. New York City, you know, they struggled a little bit more because they were a little bit more draconian about sort of how they did these things. But if they're done the right way, it's an entry point and it's a got to get out of jail free card. It's not a you're being punished for something. So in the places that have done them well, they've actually gone very, very well. I have friends that live in both the UK and France. And in France, it was so interesting because people embraced it because essentially, not only did it let me do something I really wanted to do, but I actually felt safe doing it because I knew everybody else in there. I mean, I've been going to the Overture Center, since the symphony started going again. They require a vaccine. They require everybody to wear a mask. I have no problem in that setting.
But this is what gets me, because when you travel internationally, places like Africa, where you got to have a longer list of shots, that's why you get the shot.
Yeah,
So that then you can do stuff.
right.
It doesn't mean you won't get the disease ever, but that's a reasonable, prudent thing you do to enable you to take that risk.
Yeah, and again, that's the public health messaging, is that, you're doing it for your own benefit, for the benefit of others, and you get something out of it. Like there were even programs where like, oh, we're getting free beer for getting vaccinated or getting money, like incentivizing and making it worth people's while, as opposed to making it punitive. Do this or I'm going to do something bad to you. It's a fine line. People have been trying to figure this out for hundreds of years in public health, but it's pretty clear that the carrot in most circumstances works better than the stick, as long as the carrot is worthwhile. It's got to be a tasty carrot. It's got to be fresh. Somebody's got to have peeled it for you. But then it seems to work.
Got a piece of ranch dressing in there.
Right. So like just requiring people to get a vaccine, but not giving them something but in France, they were very smart about it. And like I said, I don't think it was intentional here, but I think it was very inadvertently a positive that for whatever reason, when all the concert venues got together and decided they were going to require vaccines, boom, like all of a sudden that gave enough people a reason to go get vaccinated.
And that's for a disease that's highly contagious even among symptomless carriers.
Correct.
And that's the other thing
Right.
that I don't get is in this 2-year thing, it's like, where is the personal responsibility? Oh, I don't care if I get it. I'm not in a age group that's going to.
Well, that's the American way. Remember, it's all about, our freedom is our biggest blessing, but it's our biggest curse as well. Because it's all about me. Screw you guys. I'm out of here. Right? That's basically how, and so that's unfortunate.
Drop there. That's good.
So that is kind of, unfortunately, a lot of how the philosophy of people's lives work. And you go, like I said, I teach in Thailand. They had no vaccine. They got vaccine within 2 weeks. 70% of the population were immunized, because in the Buddhist communities, the greater good is more important than the individual. When the king says do something, they just do it. They didn't have hepatitis B vaccine in that country until 1990, I forget what year, 99. They went from 0% to 98% of the population of kids that were eligible within 1 year, because the king declared it as important. The greater good says this is what we all need to do, and they just go ahead and do it. It's pretty remarkable how different philosophies permeate different. Now they're much more comfortable with authoritarian activities as well. They may bitch about it behind closed doors, but there is that's part of the reason that our booster program was poorly messaged, but also people just didn't think it mattered or mattered to them. And they'd convince themselves like, yeah, this isn't that big a deal. It's going away. I won't get that sick from it. And so the uptake of boosters has been, depressingly slow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I gotta get going.